Welcome. I'm Ashley. You are joining us today for our Prevent Connect web conference, Connecting with Community to Prevent Sexual and Intimate Partner Violence During Crisis, Lessons Learned from Minnesota. Prevent Connect is a national project of Valor US, formerly known as the California Coalition Against Sexual Assault, sponsored by the U.S. Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. The views and information provided in this web conference do not necessarily represent the official views of the U.S. government, CDC, or Valor. Right, so we have a couple of objectives for you today. We really want to be talking about community connectedness. What are the impacts? How is it a protective factor? What the heck do we mean when we say community connectedness? We want to look at some of the impacts across the socio-ecological model as it relates to addressing systemic harms and oppression, and then think about the opportunities that community connectedness can provide when we are, employing strategies to prevent sexual and intimate partner violence, and think about what those partnerships might look like. So briefly, I want to just share with you all how Prevent Connect kind of approaches this idea of community connectedness and how we define it. We really see community connectedness as referring to the nature and the quality of engagement among community members. And this includes individuals, it includes families, it includes neighborhoods, groups, organizations, institutions, social networks. So thinking like schools, culturally based organizations, faith communities, social media, really everything that makes up a community. And it really involves not only the relationships that people have with each other, but also their engagement to the broader community. How engaged are they with the broader community? And what we see is that in connected communities, members really gain a sense of belonging. They gain a sense of purpose, and they feel that they matter, and get that experience of mattering both from getting value and adding value to their community. We also know that and believe that stronger connections have the power to really increase a person's sense of hope and self-worth, and the ability for them to cope adaptively in the face of things that are hard to cope with. And as a result, community connectedness is a protective factor that enhances well-being. It has the potential to foster resilience and really promote this idea of prevention. And so a connected community is one where people are able to build relationships, they're able to build strong social networks, and really what it boils down to is that they're really able to thrive and reach their potential. And so that's kind of just how we're thinking about community connectedness. Of course, we'll love to hear how our friends in Minnesota are thinking about community connectedness, and also how all of you are thinking about community connectedness, which brings us to our first text chat question, which is, what does community connectedness look like in your community? We would love to hear from you. What does it look like? What are some of the markers of a connected community? If you feel like maybe you don't live in a connected community, there's not a lot of community connectedness, what's missing? So feel free to think about that a little bit, put your thoughts in the chat, and we are going to kind of take a look at what's coming up, see if there's any themes, and we'll report back out on what y'all are saying in a bit. But I am ready to stop talking. So I want to introduce you to our guests today. And I'm actually going to let our guests introduce themselves, but I am just so excited to have Noelle, Peng, and Catherine here from Minnesota to share about some really critical work that has been done during the COVID-19 pandemic. And they'll tell us a lot more about that. But Noelle, Peng, Catherine, welcome. I'll let you say hi. And then I want to know how this project came to be.
Hi, I can go first. My name's Noelle Vollen, and I work with Men as Peacemakers. I use she, her pronouns, and a lot of the work that we do is community level, community-based, gender-based violence prevention. And so we talk about We Are All Connected. It's really placing an emphasis on community connectedness as a framework for, or an orientation to this prevention work that we do. One of the things that we encourage folks to do, I'm talking to close to 300 folks that have been doing prevention work probably for a long time. And there's lots of ways that we think about and talk about prevention. And my encouragement today is to kind of get out of the language that we'd use to explain community connectedness in a grant report or a grant application, and really think about this as we're going into this conversation and community narrative, and hearing the insights that we got from across Minnesota from folks that were doing really great community engagement and prevention work. Try and think of a time or a story that you might have where somebody in your family, could be chosen family, could be your actual family, a time when they've experienced crisis. And then how does family, how does community, how do friends rally together to meet the needs, right? Like, so personally, I think of a time when a relative of mine, there was a suicide attempt, and what we did as family members, the emotions we felt, the steps that we took to reach out and support the person who was really struggling at that time, how this carries on to it's not just in the moment, but it sort of like reverberates throughout the whole family. So other folks who might be effective, and then over time, and maybe as the anniversary of the attempt comes due, like what do we do as a family? What does that feel like? What does that look like? What are some practical things that you do? And what are the emotional ups and downs, right? Because that all comes into play as we're talking about community connectedness, because there are similar types of emotions happening. So, and similar steps and similar thinking and strategizing that's happening. So if you can have that, hold that story in your mind of something personally, how do folks rally? Think with that mindset and that lens, rather than this is how we're going to explain this in a grant report or in a grant application. So this came about basically our partner, our funder on this project. It was a funder approaching us, a community-based organization, and saying, hey, how have you all been able to continue your prevention programming during a global pandemic? And from MAP's perspective, we had a couple of options. We could either just kind of lay out some of the things that we had been doing and call it good, or we could do what is something that's just a core belief and a core the core of the way we do our work, which is to reach out to other communities and find out what they're doing and gather insights and do some storytelling and create a narrative that's full of wisdom. And at the same time, our funder slash partner on this was doing their own analysis based on their grantees. And so it was looking at what are our roles in the ecosystem? How do we combine our efforts to do something that is bigger and deeper and probably has a lot more wisdom, since we're not just looking at a product of, you know, what MAP is delivering, but it's a product of conversations that we had with grantees across the state. We did surveys, we did focus groups, and we did individual interviews. And I'm so excited that we have Peng with us today, so he can talk about some of the insights that he had over the global pandemic and beyond, and also preceding that. And Catherine, as you introduce yourself, I just want to ask you a favor, if you could also talk about our distinction between crisis in process and crisis event for this project.
Sure, I can. So I'm Catherine Diamond. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm from the Minnesota Department of Health. I lead the economics and evaluation unit within our injury and violence prevention section. And I had the honor, I guess, of being able to explore with grantees what they were experiencing during COVID-19 and the response to it, really asking them to share with us their experiences and their thoughts, their challenges, and their methods of overcoming these challenges. And then, as Noelle said, we then wanted to reach a little deeper. And so we reached out to our community partner men as peacemakers in this way of, in this example of community connectedness, and ask them to partner with us in this endeavor to go deeper, to find out more about the experiences of organizations. In full disclosure, I am currently right now living the COVID pandemic. I was given a positive diagnosis yesterday, and so I do have a tickle in my throat and a little bit less energy than I normally would for this, but I feel like, I'm living this project right now. So this idea came about while we were starting this work. We were really discovering that there were we kept feeling like there was this crisis of COVID-19, but there was also all this other stuff that we were digging into when we were talking to partners and grantees. And so we did some research, and what we found was that other researchers have claimed the terms crisis as process and crisis as event, which I think really fit into what we were uncovering through our conversations and our evaluations. And that was that COVID-19 was this crisis event. It was a thing that happened. I always come back to March 17th, I think was my last day in the office. And so to me, that was the crisis event, was all of a sudden things were getting real and I was being sent home. My children were being sent home. We were being told to have limited contact with people. And that is a crisis event. But what we were finding was that there was this whole crisis of process that was making it difficult for many organizations and individuals. You can talk about it on the individual level as well, but we were really concentrating on the organizational level. There were all these contexts and other events and other situations that had either, been going on for centuries, but also maybe just within the past year or two with funding, just different situations that had been happening that either put organizations in a space where they were able to face this crisis event, or they struggled greatly, or maybe they struggled with certain aspects of it. But that's the crisis of process. There were things that set people up for success or didn't set them up for success. So we were really digging into that in this evaluation report. So also, keep that in mind as we're going through these findings, is that there's a very specific crisis event, but really this crisis of process is something that we should focus on. So I think now I'm going to pass it on to our community partner. His picture isn't showing up on my screen. There he is. Would you like to introduce yourself and perhaps give us a little background on your involvement?
Yeah, thank you, Catherine. Peng here, he, him, his. I'm one of the co-executive directors at Transforming Generations, and we are quite a new organization, I would say, but we've been around for like 7 years, even though we have not infrastructurally been doing work in the way that we're doing it now, since 2 years ago only. And I think that my connection mostly is to Noelle because of her support, and as a colleague of mine as well too, that we've been talking a lot about, I think, what community connectedness means, and the way in which I think I would want to say that how oftentimes communities of color have been doing and have been moving and have been, to Noelle's point, telling stories about and sharing stories and taking lessons learned to actually do prevention work, right, in the community, and really being able to think about others in the community. And just as I was listening to Ashley talk, I was thinking about the ways in which my community, like the Hmong community, how folks don't actually think about community in terms of geographic locations or boundaries, And I think sometimes we think about that when we talk about community, is like, where's the geographic location? Is it in St. Paul? Is it in Minneapolis? And I think for a lot of the survivors that we've worked with, who are primarily Hmong women, they cross those boundaries, right? So it's not so much about geographic location, but it's about relational relationships. It's about who am I connected to? Who do I have relationships with in family or in community that I can get support from? And how do I then move into that community, right? And so we see a lot of Hmong women and survivors moving from Minnesota to Wisconsin, Wisconsin to Minnesota. And when I really think about community connectedness, then this might get into the presentation as I tend to go ahead. But it's really about relationship, right? And I think that that's the relational piece that I want to really highlight here, is the connectedness is really about the relationship and the ongoing relationship building, whether it is deepening that relationship or widening that relationship, or it is about both of those things, right? To be able to actually help create different conditions that does not allow for men and masculine folks to actually choose violence when they have to. But I'll leave it there.
I'm glad that you talked about moving ahead. So Peng has a wisdom and a way of talking about connectedness that is not only added to this project, but also like just from a personal perspective has stretched my way of thinking. And that's what we really want to do here, is really expand our understanding of prevention. And so the way we're going to talk about this project, we are a lot of what if you actually download the report, I don't even want to call it a report, but if you download the document, the narrative, what you're going to see is a lot of wisdom and quotes from Peng and people like Peng. And this all there's the data and the coding process, but basically we've distilled it down into 5 strategies that help organizations that do prevention work. And when I say that, I mean like the on-the-ground community organizations, I mean the technical assistance providers, I mean the funders, anybody that's sort of touching violence prevention work. The goal is to get them to listen to this wisdom and then translate that into some practical strategies that you can take, because from our perspective, and Ashley mentioned this at the beginning, there's community connectedness that we experience at a relational level, and that from an individual sort of standpoint, we look at how connected folks are in and how that mitigates the risk of experiencing violence or mitigates the risk of perpetrating violence. But we also want to look at like an institutional and organizational level. And there are things that we can learn from community organizations that have been doing this work, that, as Catherine mentioned, they've been dealing with all that stuff that's been under the rug. So a pandemic was just on top of it, right? And so looking at this crisis event, crisis in process, understanding that this is just a reality that folks have been living and working in while they're doing prevention work. And so what can we learn from them? How do we translate that into organizational practice? So the way this is going to work is we will read our strategy. Under each strategy, there are some sub-themes, because strategies tend to be your, subheadings in a document, and they're very broad. And sometimes we're like, what does that mean? So we've got some sub-themes that kind of help hone in and clarify what we mean by a strategy. Then I will be reading some quotes that are contained in the document that really we thought captured, but by no means is exhaustive of the wisdom that's in the document, but captured that strategy. And then I'm going to ask Peng some questions, and we'll get to hear some more of his wisdom. And it's okay if you go ahead, Peng, because this is a very fluid conversation. It's all woven together and connected. So Tori, we can go ahead to the first strategy, that slide that says strategy 1, and we can move on.
So Noelle, we actually, before we get into your strategies, we're gonna do 2 things. Number 1, I want to check in with Tori and see, Tori, if you saw some themes coming up in the chat. And then we actually have another question for the audience, and then we'll get into the strategies. So Tori, any themes coming up about, what does community connectedness look like in our audience's communities?
Yeah, excuse me. We got a really great array of answers to that last question of what does it look like for folks. Folks had mentioned a lot about like support and networks and communication and how we reach out to folks. I also saw some folks were talking about like the physical environment, the physical part of the community, like sidewalks and walking paths and some other resources and mutual aid that communities can provide each other. There was also some comments about deeply knowing who makes up a community, who a community is, including who's the leadership, who are the community elders. And I'm going to scroll up to it. I really liked Neba's comment, and please tell me in the chat if I'm pronouncing your name wrong. Neba had said, a community where people care about each other to ask about each other's lives or provide support. I feel like that is such a great everyday definition, everyday example. It really takes out all that public health jargon and boils down community connectedness to, say what we mean. So thank you everyone who responded to that last text chat question. I'm really excited to see what the responses are to our next one.
Yeah, thank you so much, Tori. Appreciate you for mining all of those great comments. So we're wondering now, Noelle, when you were speaking last, you had this slide up talking about how, oh, of course, someone wants to join the conversation. But you had a slide up talking about how 2020 kind of lifted the rug of ugliness that just gets swept under. We don't talk about it. We don't do anything about it. We don't change anything. And so we're wondering from our audience, how has your organization in the last several years really been forced to take the rug away, to expose these systemic issues, like in the previous example? What are some things that you've grappled with, that you're looking at, changes that are being made? We'd love to hear from you all about that. And with that, Noelle, I'm going to pass it back to you to get us into your first strategy.
Yeah, sure. So the first strategy that came out of all the wisdom, and I will tell you, like the conversations go really deep, and these slides are going to be just a tiny glimpse. And so I really do encourage you to look at the document. It's on the Menace Peacemakers website. Honestly, the other hope was that some of the insights that were gained from grantee organizations doing this community work and prevention work, that this could be used, and the data and the results that are kind of tacked on at the end too, could be used to help explain to our other partners and stakeholders and funders. So please feel free and get some deeper insights, because we're just going to scratch the surface a bit on this, but we'd love to have you guys dive deeper with this content like we were able to do. But the first strategy was expanding the understanding of and approach to prevention in order to achieve health equity. And I'm going to let Catherine talk about what we mean by that, because there's a lot that we can mean by that, and probably you all can chat into of what your understanding of that is as well.
Right. So I think, excuse me, as we talked about many different definitions of community connectedness and community, there are a lot of different definitions of prevention. And so really it's allowing an expansion of that word prevention to encompass all of the things that are true prevention, not just prevention in the way of washing your hands may prevent you from getting COVID, but it's then looking at, okay, how do we actually get people to access hand sanitizer or sinks and clean water? So expanding this idea of prevention that can help us to reach health equity. So within this larger strategy, we identified some kind of sub-strategies, sub-themes to get us to this larger strategy. And there are 4 of them for this. One is integrate injury and violence prevention efforts with basic community health and well-being. So really just acknowledging that injury and violence prevention is basic. It should be included in all of the different types of health and well-being actions that we take. The second is address both individual and community level trauma in prevention programming, which I think I'll go out on a limb and say probably most of the people that are on this call understand or have an understanding of what trauma-informed prevention is, but it's making sure that that's included on the individual and community level. And with that, it's educating others on what that is. You know, funders may not be as versed in that type of conversation. The third is ensure programming is designed by the community being served. Communities are different, so prevention initiatives cannot be one size fits all. And that's a theme that really goes throughout this report, is including community in the decisions, in the actions, in the activities that are being planned. And the fourth and final sub-strategy within this is adopt community connectedness as the foundation for prevention work. We just kept coming back over and over again to this idea that when organizations were linked together on some level, whether that was official partnerships or it was just knowing about each other, they were able to be stronger and to be more successful during this time of compounding crisis.
Thank you, Catherine. So I'm going to read a quote that helped capture this strategy, and then I'm going to ask Peng a question. So one of the quotes that we had was, and I'm sure that many of you can relate to this, money is hyper specific to certain things. So for all of you who have had to apply for project-based, program-based funding, and you're like, we need Gen Ops funding, this is going to resonate with you. Money is hyper specific to certain things, but if you can address someone's housing issue, then you can address the violence that they're facing in their lives. So that is a quote that I thought was perfect to this. It sort of points to the practices and the systems that we have in place for doing prevention work. And what this strategy is really trying to capture is like a reorientation to that work. How would prevention be different? How would this work be different if we were starting from a framework of connectedness, if we were letting the communities that we were working in design prevention programming, and if we were looking at both individual and community level trauma and looking at basic health and well-being as a core element, right, to injury and violence prevention. So Peng, I know that you and I have talked about, as we're sort of talking through how do we write this report, or how do we explain this to certain funders, how do we use CDC language and try and communicate, though, the heart of the work that community-based prevention organizations do, like Transforming Generations. What does prevention look like in different communities? And you touched on this a little bit in your introduction when you talked about relationships, but what would you and all of Transforming Generations, what would you want funders to know, partners to know, technical assistance providers to know, or understand about prevention that is different than how we've sort of been in the habit of talking about it?
Thank you. Yeah, I think that for us, one of the things that isn't thought about, I think even in the prevention matter or approach that has been used by many of us in some ways to sort of guide our work, is the cliche of teaching people how to actually fish, right? And for us, that really means that we have to actually organize our community. We really have to organize the survivors. And what does that really mean, right? Not only providing them education insight about the violence that is actually happening in their lives and impacting their lives, not just through domestic violence and sexual violence or other forms of violence, but violence that Ashley was mentioning earlier on as well too, so that they actually have some tools and resources so that they could actually really think about how they move in their life in community. And then I think the other part that comes up to me, particularly in this question that I've been trying to relate to a previous colleague at MDH at the Department of Health, was that when we look at the level where we're talking about like systems engagement, right? Well, when you have systems that are actually harmful, but the approach is like work with those systems, how do you actually work with systems that are actually harmful? So the example I would give you there is like in the Hmong community, there's an organization called the 18 Clan Council, and they decide a lot of domestic violence situations. A lot of couples go there to resolve domestic violence, but because it's built in patriarchy and the foundation of patriarchy is there in lifting up the lives of men and the experiences of men, how is it that we're supposed to work with that system to actually change its approach when that system, meaning the people and the gate holders, don't want to actually move or change? Yes, they've done great things for the community, and yes, they did a walk, but that was pretty much it. Yes, they set up a hotline, but nobody answered that hotline. So I think that's my sort of tension point, is like, how do you work with systems when systems are built on the foundation that allows for that violence to actually happen, right? So how do you, now we need to really think about, like in the organizing part of it, is how do we also create new systems or new ways of actually thinking about how to actually intervene in the violence or prevent the violence from happening. So at Transforming Generations, we think about our LGBTQ identified young people and folks, and we know that they experience not only gender-based violence, but they also experience domestic violence and sexual violence in their lives, or gender identity violence that is towards the identities or sexual orientation. So we create a drop-in space for young people virtually to come and just have organic conversations in community with one another. It has nothing to do with violence, but it is a place where people can be seen and heard and felt, and then they can actually take something away, right? Or we create places or spaces where survivors can actually connect through gardening. So we have a garden that survivors can go and garden together. But that's a way for them to actually build community. That's a way for them to actually not feel isolated, not feel alone in the atrocities that they're facing in their life, and that they can then connect with other survivors as well too, right? Or being able to actually, like, I remember years ago when we started the work around abusive international marriages in the Hmong community, where we connected the women that were here to the women who were overseas in Thailand and Laos, and being able to actually have them connect and talk about what was the real issue here, what was the root of why they actually are thinking about hating each other. And so I think that in those different levels, it's like we work on all spaces of it at all times, and it's not just like one way only, or one thing at a time, addressing one place at a time, or like sort of like boxing it in neatly. That's what I want to say. But it's really being able to actually ebb and flow through those different levels. And one of the things that I always often say that isn't listed on there is really the culture of patriarchy isn't really listed on, right? And that's what we're really talking about, is when we're trying to change attitudes and shift definitions or shift values in community, we're really trying to change the culture of patriarchy that says men should be in relationship in this way to women, and women should be in relationship to men in this way, and to other genders in this way as well too, and how men and boys should relate to one another, and what is and how they navigate that, and how they respect men in that. And so in our work, it's really about changing the practices that enable and allow for men to really feel lifted, and allow for the violence to then be seen as okay, or visible practices that allow for men's lives to be really sacred, seen as sacred, quote unquote, when it's actually in fact not, right? And I think those are the pieces that sometimes are not in the levels of the approach to prevention, is the practices that actually happen in community that then Noel and us talked about this a couple of weeks, that then become rules or the ways of how we are supposed to be in community because we've just done it that way forever and generations, right? So I just wanted to highlight some of those snippet pieces. And the other part of it is like, people have to understand that prevention is something that it's not so far removed from their lives. It is actually something that they can simply do. So my colleague always says, if grandma cannot understand what we are doing, and if grandma is sitting at the table with us and she doesn't understand the work we're doing, and we can't explain it to her, it's not going to work, right? It is not going to work. So grandma has to actually understand it in the language that she speaks, in her experiences, in her worldview of how she actually relates to domestic violence, how she relates to sexual violence, how she knows it to be in her community, and the way in which she actually is in relationship to it. If she can understand all of that, and we're talking about it to her in those terms and in those ways, then perhaps she can get on board with prevention. But I think sometimes the wording and the language, we get caught up in that, and it's not simplified enough to where people in our community can actually really understand what that is.
Oh, Peng. I could sit and listen to your wisdom for hours. Well, I'm glad that I get to work with you and actually get to hear your wisdom. And I think too, like there were so many layers woven into that, but it really underlined that idea and the strategy of like, we can't talk about prevention in one way. We have to sort of expand our understanding. Maybe telling funders that prevention looks like what grandma can also do to prevent gender-based violence. And so I appreciate that. And I love what's been coming in on the chats too. And so Tori or Ashley, whenever you think it's appropriate to highlight some of those points, we can, or we can move on to strategy 2.
Yeah,
Oh, could
while
I
we're here,
add?
let's
Oh,
just, no, you
go
go.
ahead, Tori. I was just going to
No,
add
no,
something,
you
but I
add.
don't know if I'll lift it up later on. But I think that even in prevention, we have to think about what we also have to come around to the intervention part about it as well too. And I think what's valuable to us at Transforming Generations is that we know to all the ways in which people experience violence in their lives and the trauma that we were talking about, that then people can actually cause harm. And how do you recognize that? So the transformative justice piece about the prevention is being able to understand the people who harm have also experienced harm themselves. So how do you move in that duality, right? Because in this society, we're taught that people
You might be frozen. Okay. We're going to work on Ping's internet coming back to us. Oh.
No,
Ping, I think,
not yet.
Oh, there you are. There
Okay,
you are.
good.
You're
Oh, sorry. I have a bad connection too. I wanted to say that the last thing that I don't know where I left off, but I wanted to say that in community connectedness and in the transformational justice there, transformative justice there, is that we have to be so keen on understanding that and acknowledging that our people cannot be disposable, that we can't just lock up and throw our people away, because we just can't do that. And I think in this society, in capitalism, we're taught that people are disposable and we just throw people away at any time if we want to throw them away. But in our community at Transforming Generations, we know that that's not true, and we can't be acting and moving like that.
Thank you so much for making those points. I think, you know, your conversation around if grandma doesn't understand what we're doing, that that has been something that, we've been talking about at Prevent Connect for a while now, that we talk about how prevention takes everyone, that we need everyone, and yet we don't use language or like it's not accessible to everyone. People can't understand what it means because of this language and explanation that we've definitely created through some of the projects that have been funded. And so I thought that was such an important point. And then holding those two truths, right? Again, we need everyone. There are people that we can't just, throw away, like you said, Peng, that we really need to figure out how we navigate our communities and move forward. So Tori, I want to turn to you and see what other things you've seen come up in the chat.
Sure. Thanks, Ashley. And thank you, Peng, for bringing that into the conversation. A lot of people are resonating with that in the chat. And I want to read Shoshana's most recent message out to everyone. So Shoshana says, yes, we teach accountability in our prevention curriculum and spend a lot of time cultivating empathy for both people who cause harm and people who have been harmed, explaining to our kids that people will never own up to their behavior and change it if owning up to it will remove them from the community. So I thought that comment just was so great to bring into this conversation, and Peng, all the points that you had brought up too. Our earlier question about, relating back to that quote earlier of how has the COVID-19 pandemic forced your organization to take the rug away, to have some necessary changes. And folks were really talking about how it changed the way that we work together. And that's leading to a lot more action and organizing around equity, inclusion, and diversity, both within their organizations and within community work. I also saw people were bringing up a lot of challenges around access and inaccessibility of the way that we were doing things before, or is what we're doing now also accessible and acceptable to our communities. And then, Peng, you were talking about when you do prevention, you also need to be, looking at the intervention side too. You can't just silo them off and separate them away. And folks in our audience were talking about that too. I saw Robin bring up comments about the necessity of basic needs for survivors and for prevention. And then Eric had brought up survivor-centered and survivor-led prevention and solutions, where survivors are equal in finding prevention solutions and engaging their communities, and they're also experts in their own experiences.
Tori, we'll turn it back over to you all to hear about the second strategy.
The second strategy, a lot of this is common language, terminology, this in our headspace. We know, we've been discussing it, but what does that look like on the ground? And what does that look like from like a personal storytelling perspective is one way that I encourage folks to think about this. But for strategy 2, we talk about centering the voices, leadership, and expertise of those most impacted by the conditions that create barriers to health equity, address systemic conditions that propagate disparities. And Catherine, I'll turn it over to you if you want to do the sub-themes.
Sure, there are 2 sub-themes for this strategy. The first is acknowledge and place into context the barriers to health equity. Crisis events amplify the systemic conditions that community-based prevention organizations continue to work to address. And the second is assess for the ways prevention efforts inadvertently amplify community harm. When prevention work is disconnected from communities, initiatives are ineffective at best and may inadvertently exacerbate or create additional harms. And I think these are just great sub-strategies, and they definitely link to the strategy 1. And I know there was some conversation in the chat about how to learn more about how some evidence-based prevention efforts have caused harm. And I think this is a great way to think about it when the community members are not involved, and folks come in thinking that they do have the answer when in fact, perhaps they are exacerbating the harm that that exists or the inequities that exist.
Yeah, and this one, this is a strategy where we pulled the rug quote. So I'm going to read it again. And because we can't underscore it enough, because we're not just talking about the pandemic as that crisis event, we're talking about the crisis that's been in progress. So I'll say this, 2020 lifted up the rug of all the ugliness we've swept under the rug. And it just said, you know what, no more rug. Have all your crap. And then not only just have it, we're going to place more crap on top of it. And it's really forced organizations and funders to think about how we do community work. And so we talk about this, right? We've probably like exhaustively had conversations organizationally, even within our, maybe even within like our personal spheres, right? We've had these conversations. And so what I want to do right now is get us out of like that up here, this disconnected conversation, and let's just think about on the ground the reality of it, right? Think about your personal story of when somebody experiences crisis, and acknowledge where there could be a crisis event. How does your family rally? How do you rally? What does it feel like? What are the things that you have to go through? How does that translate into work that you do individually and then work that you do collectively to sort of address those needs? And so have that in mind as your stance towards this issue. And I'm going to ask Peng the question, like on the ground in reality, rather than using terms like systemic barriers and harms and like what for the rug quote, like what is the crap? What does that look like in your community? How did Transforming Generations address that crap, right? Like for let's just get it real.
Yeah, thank you. I think what comes to my mind really is I had some thoughts that I initially wrote down, but I think what really speaks to me at this moment is there's the pandemic, then George Floyd, like in Minneapolis, and then anti-Asian violence that actually is happening. And along that, domestic violence and sexual violence has intensified, definitely, right? And so for our organization, it's like navigating all four of these things simultaneously. And then being able to say, what do we prioritize at what moment? With the George Floyd thing, our community, we had really talked to our community about the anti-Blackness that was really showing up. And how do we be in solidarity to the Black folks in our community, and to Black women, to Black queer folks, and to Black trans folks, and Black gender nonconforming folks, right? How do we show up for the community? And how do we also be teaching and be telling our community how to show up in solidarity for Black folks in this moment, right? Because of this uprising that's actually happening, because of the murder of George Floyd. And then come along, because of the pandemic, then you come along anti-Asian violence, hate that is actually happening and it's like rippling through the country. And how do you move in that, right? So for us, it was really important at points to say, okay, yeah, we understand the connection of all these things, right? We understand the connection between all of this violence, and it comes from these other systemic pieces that we've all known and talked about. And in community, it means we have to do a lot of different strategies in community, in talking about it in our domestic violence groups with the men that we work with, and talking about it to survivors that we work with. So engaging the people who are coming for services, not only for services, but engaging on social media platforms, engaging on in radio talks and in other platforms that are out in the community, to be able to actually share the connection of like how gender-based violence actually ties to anti-Blackness, how it actually ties to anti-Asian violence that is actually happening in this moment. And so that's like the quick like summation that I want to be sharing with all of you in terms of like the complexity of how we as an organization that is based in the community have to navigate, and really thinking about at what moment do we actually center whose voices And at what moment do we then say, hey, we need to be standing in solidarity, and that means we're centering the voices of Black women and queer folks in this moment, within our organization, right? How does our organization really evolve and be a gender justice organization? How does our organization really be a queer justice organization? How does our organization really be an anti-Blackness organization? And what does that really mean in the practices of how we are moving in the moment? And so that means we have to have these critical conversations amongst our board members, our team, and the people that we're in constant contact with, who are coming to us for services, and being able to be visible with these things as we engage communities in the midst of this pandemic, right? So there's just like a lot there, and people can feel very overwhelmed at times to the messages that we may send out and may put out, because we're like, yes. And then at the same time, we're saying these are all like connected one to the other, right?
Thanks, Ping. Ashley, I was just, sorry, I got distracted by what was going on in the chat. There's some pretty good points that were being made. And I don't know, we didn't talk about who's going to talk about what's in the chats so much, but there are some things that I appreciated. Somebody talking about how, we've professionalized violence intervention or prevention. And so we're sort of creating these positions and having that one person or that one position represent entire communities. And so it's actually leaving folks out. And then another practice that's sort of emerged that is harmful and not helpful at all is asking folks to participate in focus groups or volunteer, but we're not compensating them for their wisdom. And I think that Peng, you made some really good points about like really trying to help folks understand the layers of what folks are having to navigate within different communities. And that it's all together at once, that it's all interconnected, and how do we have the strategies to address all those different layers, and then at the same time, to the points that are being made in the chat, do it in a way that isn't also exploitive or perpetuating any harm. So I truly appreciated that perspective. Maybe we can move on to 3, which is meant to support and amplify and invest in community-based organizations that meet community need and work towards health equity. I think we have, you have the folks that are sort of commonly called upon. They are seen as experts. They take on a role or position within the sort of prevention ecosystem, where they're often at the forefront and their expertise is sought after. And to that point about professionalization, who is actually also doing some work, and who do we also need to hear from, is an important part of doing prevention work, not just during like the crisis event, but just ongoing. And so Catherine, if you wanted to look at the sub-themes for strategy 3.
Sure. And I think strategy 3 starts to really draw out this this concept that's in the document, in the narrative at large, that we're not just talking to, or this document isn't just made for community-based organizations, but we really found some great information for funders. And we really hope that this can get into the hand of some funders. I'm coming from the point of the funder of this project. MDH was the one that provided the money to do this, but we were able to do it in such an amazing way that lifted community voices. It put community voices first. We took a major step back in it, but we partnered together in the analysis and in the learning that came from it. So, so strategy 3, I think, starts to highlight that. The sub strategies that came from this are support community-based prevention organizations to respond to emergent increased community need. I think that focuses on being flexible with funding and allowing some flexibility in there. because what you fund in 2019 might not be what is actually the issue that needs to have funding in 2020. So that was a big lesson. The second sub-strategy is support on-the-ground staff who often put themselves in high-risk situations to meet community need. That really came from the fact that injury and violence prevention workers were on the front line during COVID-19. They did not have the option to work remotely oftentimes. And so they were really putting themselves at risk to stay committed to their communities. The third sub-strategy is provide sustainable funding models that invest in prevention efforts as essential community services. Invest in long-term systems change towards health equity. And this really came through, and Noelle touched on it at the beginning, but perhaps the best way that a funder can support an organization or have the most impact is to support the salary of the finance director. Maybe that's what will allow the organization to do the important work, or maybe funding a printer, a copy machine will actually be the thing that allows prevention work to happen. This also ties into that idea of expanding the definition of prevention. But this strategy specifically focuses on really the need to fund those things or allow those things to be funded.
Thanks, Catherine. And we've got a couple of quotes for this one, and probably there's going to be some like heads nodding. I can't see them on the screen, but oftentimes when we read these quotes, people are like, yes. So the first quote says, our prevention shifted into what do you need right now and what is going to be helpful. It really looked completely different. I mean, we still engaged, but I would be lying if I tell you that, yes, we engaged to talk about teen dating violence and healthy masculinity. That did not happen. So really just highlighting like an organization that was pivoting. They already had this very deep and nuanced understanding that preventing teen dating violence will also include flexibility and meeting basic needs. So that was one quote. And another quote said, funding support needs to go beyond just 1 or 2 years. To think that anything can be accomplished having community at the center and really being guided by community in just a year is just unrealistic. And so again, that pointed to that investment, that long-term sustainable investment in doing work that we know is a long-term process. We know transforming community conditions is not a 1 or 2 year grant funding period. It occurs over such a long time. And so if we're really wanting to invest in prevention, what is that going to look like? What does that take then from a funder standpoint? And that gets us squirmy because we're not always used to that funding infrastructure. So those are 2 quotes that came out of this particular strategy. And Peng, for the question for you, this brings in some conversations that I've had with your colleague, Mai Teng, and we talked a lot about how, because she also contributed to this project, and we talked about how, there's the funding relationship and how we can support, for lack of a better term, culturally specific organizations, but basically like those organizations that are doing work in community. How do mainstream or your more traditionally funded organizations, as well as funders, how can they support organizations like Transforming Generations? And this can look like, what does this look like during a pandemic? But what does this also look like beyond that pandemic, right? Looking at the process.
Yeah, it's interesting because our organization, like I shared earlier on, had opened its doors for the work that we're doing at this moment in terms of having paid full-time staff and paid staff to do this work just about 2 years ago, right before the pandemic actually started. And it took us 5 years to get to this place, even though we founded the organization back in 2015, right? And that's the difference between community organizations that are based in community, that are based culturally, and are coming from cultural communities, is that the infrastructure piece of it is, and the foundation building of it takes such a long time, because not only because of the lack of funding, but because of the lack of hard skills that actually people have. So it came about, like for Transforming Generations, we came about because it was people who were community organizers who were passionate about gender justice in the community, that were passionate about domestic violence and sexual violence, and wanting to say, hey, how do we actually get more visibility and attention to these issues and these experiences and the oppression that is actually happening to our women and girls and queer folks and gender non-conforming folks in our community, right? With no funding, right? With no funding, because several of us are doing 2 or 3 other things on the side, or working 2 or 3 jobs at the same time. And I know to this day, even in St. Paul, that there are some other folks who are starting organizations in their own community who are working by themselves, or 1 or 2 other people only, right? And they don't have that. And so I think that the support really is around infrastructure building, being able to have bigger mainstream organizations take on the admin pieces, if they can physically sponsor community-based or culturally specific based organizations, and being able to actually teach them how to do that. Otherwise, for us, I will share with all of you, and some of you probably did this too, is that we had to learn on the go, like everything we had to learn. Filling out the tax exempt form, filling out the 990. My colleague just did that yesterday, and she had to learn that entire process by herself, right? And learning how to do that, because we didn't have the funds to actually support an accountant to be able to do that in-house at this moment, because that would take away from the capacity of being able to provide services in community at this moment to people, right? And the capacity is so small that we were hitting the ground running. And that is oftentimes what it is, I think, for culturally based organizations in their communities, is that people are hitting the ground running and having to build things as they are providing services, or as they're doing prevention work, or as they're doing intervention work in the community. So they're doing everything all at once, and it becomes really overwhelming. So it makes a huge difference if funding goes beyond just the funding of like $10,000, $20,000 grants. Like $250,000, we would always say, or $300,000 would be life-changing for organizations. And that's what it was for us. And I think the amplification of our work and our expertise in our own communities, and our contributions to the collective work of gender-based violence is very much necessary for us to actually think about how we actually end gender-based violence across the board in society, right? But if we only I think somebody said this earlier, if we only look at those professionals and those experts who've been doing this work and highlighting those voices, then we forget about all the folks who are actually working on the ground in the community, who actually have the nuances and understanding about how to actually provide solutions that actually work and matter. And the part that I want to lift up here in this moment is that there's been several cases in St. Paul where Hmong women have not only been supported by mainstream organizations, which is great, but also in that support has also caused harm to Hmong women at the same time too, right? And so I think the most recent case was a Hmong woman killing her husband about 2 months ago, but she's a survivor of domestic violence for years, right? She's a survivor of domestic violence, and so finally she killed the person who was harming her. And the work is that we had to really share with our coalition, Violence Free Minnesota, and with our sibling organizations in St. Paul to say, hey, how do you follow the leadership of Transforming Generations? Not only Transforming Generations, but Hmong advocates who are embedded in community to be able to work with this survivor, because we understand that right now in community, people are saying these things about Hmong women. It's not just only about her, but it's about the implication of that outcome of that case to Hmong women everywhere, right? Regardless of where they live. And so I think sometimes in an individualistic society, we don't think about that kind of implication, but when we live and are connected in community, the implication is ripples and goes so far. And so I think that leadership and sharing and letting our partners and other organizations know to say, in this moment, you've got to really follow our lead and move the way that we need you to move and say these things. Say, this is what you need to say. And so I think we were grateful for Violence-Free Minnesota to really put out a statement and to really lift up Transforming Generation in that moment, and the Hmong advocates, regardless of where they work, not only just at Transforming Generations.
Thank you, Peng. I think that story really highlights that oftentimes when we get into narratives about violence prevention, we fall into like this routine or habit of talking about violence occurring in a certain way, and it's way more nuanced, way more complex than that. And the essential relying on those that are experts in the community, that's critical. I also think there's this stepping back and evaluating what your role is in the ecosystem and looking at where you can leverage your resources to do that, to promote the expertise of community work. And, it could be as simple as loaning a room if a newly starting organization doesn't have an office to work from or a fax machine. It could be helping fill out paperwork, all the way to what Violence-Free Minnesota did, which was to issue a statement saying, listen, in this situation, you need to listen and follow the leadership of groups like Transforming Generations. And so I think Strategy 3 definitely speaks to funders, and it speaks to others in the prevention community, and how we can invest, not just funding, but like all of our resources, everything that's at our disposal, and leverage those to support community-based organizations that are in and of the community. And I want to move on to Strategy 4 if we're short on time. Otherwise, I think there might have been a question in between here for participants. And I'm just going to look to you and Ashley, Ashley and Tori on the next slide there.
Yes, thank you so much, Noelle. We do have another question for the audience. And so that is, we're just wondering, what does it look like or what has it looked like for you to be able to meet community need and work toward health equity, specifically during times of crisis or instability? And we'll put that, Claudia, thank you so much for putting that language in the chat. We'd love to hear what y'all are saying. We'll circle back and see what's coming up for you. I'm really appreciating the comments coming up in the chat as well. We are reading every single one of those. So Noelle, I'll pass it back to you to get us to the next strategy.
So Strategy 4 really spoke to the need to be flexible and not so rigid and like get these deliverables done. So it's pause and pivot to ensure that any adaptations to prevention programming actually meet community need. Systems partners need to create and support infrastructures that allow this flexibility. And so Catherine, I'll let you read the sub-themes and then I'll move on to the quote.
It was bound to happen at some point, my mute. So we have 4 sub-themes. The first one is allow time and effort to develop internal policies and practices. The second is engage community members to ensure ongoing alignment between programmatic efforts and community need. 3 is allow flexibility for programmatic shifts. Meeting community need entails more than technology or moving to virtual programming. And 4 is ensure funding provides time for pausing and adaptation in partnership with community. And I think these sub-themes really summarize a lot of what's already been discussed, but this idea of really listening to the community, following their lead, but allowing for the flexible funding to actually follow their lead and work with them as leaders that know what will work within their own community.
At Men as Peacemakers, we valued the ability to pause and pivot. And I think our leadership took effort to do that, because I think a lot of folks jumped towards technology as the solution. And so this next quote kind of highlights the fact that being able to pause and pivot is more than just moving to Zoom. One thing we learned is that people use technology in different ways. So we would get guys that would come into our programming, but they're in the same rooms as their children or their partners, so they don't feel comfortable talking about what was happening. So we had to take a hard pause and stop and ask them, what can we do to help make this more effective for you? Instead of just assuming that what we could do was replicate what we've been doing in person. And so just as your experience, Peng, with transforming generations, what was the value, or what is the value of being able to pause and pivot, particularly during times of crisis when it comes to doing community prevention work?
I think this is more of an internal thing for us at Transforming Generations. What we found along the way was that we needed to actually not just always have business meetings, quote unquote, within the organization, but we needed to insert in what we call values conversations, right? That we hold bi-weekly. So it'd be about 2 times a month with the whole entirety of the team. Just talking about what do we actually value and how do we see it play out in the organization? Or what are things that are coming up that is showing itself in the way in which we're doing our work in community, or the way in which we're seeing the manifestation of the violence in the community, right? And so that, for us, having those conversations allows us to not only build richer connections internally amongst the team, but being able to actually see within each other and within the team how we're actually practicing values of the organization, right? Of the way we want to actually be transforming community, and how we're actually moving in that transformation as well too. So it allows for that kind of a reflection. And sometimes those conversations are very organic. It's not guided in any way. It's not agenda driven in any way, but it's a chance for us to actually do some of that reflection and some of that pausing of what's been coming up and what is going on. And then I think the other part of it for us in the midst of this crisis was to build time internally for team care to actually happen, where collective care can actually happen. So we built in time on Friday mornings to just do 30-minute sitting with each other, whether it is journaling virtually together by yourself, but in the presence of others, or whether it is through doing Tai Chi movements together, or yoga, or meditation, whatever the case may be. But that 30-minute, or processing a hard and challenging situation that actually occurred to a teammate that week. So building in that time, I think for us, that is a strategy that is more internal than external at this moment.
Yeah, I think that really speaks to your point, Peng, at the beginning, where, oftentimes we think about geographical understandings of what community is, but actually there's community in different ways, including internally in the organization. There's that internal community and well-being of folks, and then just acknowledging too that staff and volunteers are often part of the communities being served, and so broadening our understanding of that. I know we're running kind of short on time, so maybe we can hop ahead to strategy 5, which is to adopt community connectedness as the foundation of prevention. And by that, we mean an orientation or stance towards this work. And Catherine, if you want to go to the sub-themes, then we can read the quote and hear from Peng again.
Sure, the sub-themes are simple in words, but complex in action. But the idea is that community connectedness should be looked at within the organization, between organizations and their broader community, and then between and among community and systems partners. And with systems partners, that's where we included funders and other audiences of the organization's work.
So the quote we have from this is, This person says, so to me, when we talk about healthy, thriving, and flourishing communities, it has to be a partnership. It can't just be your organization coming in with the cape on and you're being a superhero to save the community. Peng, you mentioned this, and I'm glad that you did. In your response before, you mentioned the term collective care. And I know that Transforming Generations is working on a sexual assault advocacy manual for the Hmong community, but I think there's actually a lot of wisdom in that manual that could extend to all sorts of organizations. And one of the guiding themes of that is this idea of collective care. So can you talk about what prevention could look like from a collective care standpoint?
Yeah, I think part of that is being able to actually like witness each other's community, and in that witnessing, being able to actually like amplify the experiences of one another, right? So the learning, not just like the cross-cultural learning that needs to actually happen, but being able to actually allow for communities to actually unravel in their own, I don't want to say chaos, but that's what's coming to my mind at this moment. And so that might not be the best word. So I'll give you an example there. There's been so many folks that have asked us over the years to create a domestic violence group for Karen folks, right? Particularly Karen men, because they have their refugee population, and there's not a lot of like service providers who actually are equipped to actually provide good services to the Karen community in this moment. And there's such a huge need around domestic violence. And we've been asked and approached to actually do some of that. And we're like, no, we don't think we can be in the best place to actually do that. Our care towards them is to support their community, to be able to actually create those programs themselves, because they actually are best positioned to actually understand the nuances of actually what is actually happening in the community around domestic violence, and understanding the root causes of how domestic violence actually looks like in their community. And from that place, then they can actually talk about what prevention looks like in their community, right? Rather than to this quote, rather than us going in there and utilizing interpreters. And though interpreters is great, I want to say that, I think my push has always been in collective care. It means that the interpreters that we're using have to also be trained on the terms and nuances and the analysis of how domestic violence and sexual violence and other forms of gender-based violence actually looks like in that community. And they have to be able to actually understand the implications of the words that could be potentially coming out of their mouth that they're translating at the same time too, right? So the looking out for one another, but the witnessing of growth and change in one another's community, and not trying to dictate the solution that actually makes sense to that community in that moment, or to be able to say, why don't you try this, right? But really being able to actually say, what can we do? And how do we take the lessons learned from what you all have done to then deconstruct that in our own community and construct it in a way that actually makes sense. So even for our 40-hour sexual assault curriculum here, it's really a build-off of MUSEC, the Minnesota Indian Sexual Assault Coalition's own culturally specific 40-hour sexual assault curriculum that some of our staff went through. And we were like, oh, we need to do that as well too. And the idea for us in our community around collective care is that people can actually, everybody should be taking care of one another, right? And so that means, how do we equip our people and our folks with the tools and the resources to actually navigate the sexual violence when it actually happens, right? Not just only for people who want to be volunteers and advocates, but again, for grandma, so that grandma can have the tools and the resources to talk about sexual violence when it actually happens. And she can actually navigate it with the survivor or with herself in her family, right?
Thank you, Peng. And then we'll turn it over to Tori and Ashley. But I will just say that we have a couple of slides towards the end that have the link to getting the community narrative and also contact information, especially those of you who are interested in hearing more about the Transforming Generations Sexual Assault Advocacy Manual. which is in development, but for those of you who are interested, there's contact information, so you can be updated on that. And thank you so much, all of you, for your attention and listening.
Yeah, oh my gosh, thank you all so much. It was really cool to hear how you all just kind of added to this project, how you shared the pieces that you could bring to this project, your wisdom, your expertise, your experiences, and it was just so fascinating to kind of hear how you all work together. And I loved being able to pose some of these questions to you, Peng, and hear your response, and how these things, these strategies really resonated in your communities. So Claudia put the link. I really highly encourage y'all, if you haven't checked out the document, to do that. We wanted to know which of the 5 strategies resonated with you all. Oh, Tori, you're the best. And going back to those. So these are the 5 strategies again. I know folks are hopping off, but we'd love to know if there was a particular strategy that really resonated with you all. We'd love to know. They're here, they're in the document. And then finally, and I think, this is something for us to just kind of take with us as we move through the future. And that is what are some things that you could do to support community connectedness as a strategy? We'd love to just, I'll be thinking about that. I invite you to join me in thinking about that. We'd love to keep this conversation going, because I do think that community connectedness can be a really broad strategy, but I think it's a really promising strategy that has a lot of opportunities. So I just want to thank our guests again. Gosh, Peng, Noelle, Catherine, it's been such a pleasure having you on this web conference. Thank you for sharing. I want to thank our audience. I mean, there's such a rich conversation happening in the chat, and we try so hard to bring that into the conversation. And sometimes, time gets away from us, but I just really want to appreciate you all, your insights, and sharing your experiences, wisdom, and strength in this work. And thank you to Tori, thank you, Claudia, thank you, Aberdeen Captioning. We could not do these web conferences without you all. This web conference was recorded. The recording will be available probably within about a week. We will send an email out to everyone who registered, letting them know that the recording is available. You'll also be receiving a post. I forgot the difference between pre and post. Post-evaluation survey in the next 15 minutes or so. And at the completion of that, there is an opportunity to download a certificate of attendance. So if that's something that you're looking for, that's where you can get it. Also, feel free to email me if you need help with that. Thank you again. We hope to see you on a future Prevent Connect web conference. I think our next one is in December. So we'll see you next month. Take care, everyone. Have a wonderful rest of your week. This is going to officially end our web conference for today. Presenters, we'd love for you to stay